I will explain to you the structure of this course. The basic foundations involving this whole course are provided in Module 1 to 8, which would require a study of historical aspects as to the universal origins of intellectual property law. We will discuss a bit of how intellectual property evolved in Europe, in America, and a bit of it about the Indian law and how in the earlier British era they were enacted, and subsequently post independence what has been the reforms involving intellectual property. So from a historical perspective, and some important lessons also to learn from history of intellectual property. Second, we will also learn the theoretical paradigms involving intellectual property, or the theoretical aspects. Here we will try and look into various theories propounded by property theorists like Locke, Hegel, Kant and others, and how they can be used today to justify intellectual property, of course with certain limitations. We will also look into economic aspects as to what is this market failure in inventions, why intellectual property is a system that is often talked about as creating some kind of an efficiency, also some kind of a dynamic efficiency, because it provides incentives to innovation, although the price that the society has to pay is the loss of price competition. We will also study some international law aspects involving treaties like the WTO TRIPS agreement, that is the World Trade Organization's agreement on trade related aspects of intellectual property rights, which is enforced since 1995. Also along with it, we will also study important WIPO treaties like the Berne, Paris and other conventions that are referenced in the TRIPS agreement. The reason why we have to study the international law aspects is because by virtue of the creation of the WTO, including the dispute settlement, these treaties are enforceable in international law like many other treaties, but which has special ramifications in terms of domestic compliance. So for example, Indian laws have to be compliant with TRIPS post India signing the WTO agreements. We will also study certain aspects of the convergence between competition law and intellectual property rights, or the conflicts involving intellectual property rights and the competition law and policy. This is very important because most jurisdictions are not able to settle whether the relationship has certain tensions and how those tensions should be resolved through legal mechanisms. Because competition law has to deal with dynamic efficiency to promote innovation, and intellectual property serves the same purpose by providing market exclusivity. Most scholars on this point have raised an important issue that both the ends are the same. However, there may be tension in the means, because intellectual property provides market exclusivity while competition law seeks to somehow deter any kind of market exclusivity or monopoly unless it is specifically provided through law. Finally, access, human rights and constitutional dimensions of intellectual property have to be understood. So in this module, we are going to understand the public policy aspects involving the effects of intellectual property rights, primarily because intellectual property rights allows through its market exclusivity to raise prices, and how price based competition might be stifled due to certain kind of use and abuse of intellectual property. How free speech, human right to health and other constitutional dimensions of access, how can they be resolved, will be discussed in this specific module. Furthermore, module 8 to 41 will discuss the core of intellectual property rights, both in terms of its substantive and procedural content. In these modules, you will discuss the subject matter threshold distinctly involving patents, copyrights, trademarks, geographical indications, industrial designs and all other forms of intellectual property rights, and what kind of subject matter they protect and why they are different. We will also discuss the qualification thresholds. So patents, if certain subject matter is protected, what are the qualification requirements that may warrant such protection in the form of novelty, inventive step, utility or industrial application. Similarly, originality in case of copyright, distinctiveness in case of trademarks. So, we will study these qualification thresholds. We will also study how copyright law defines inventors, authors and the creator and its relationship with property. Then we will also discuss the scope of rights and how those rights get exhausted after the first sale, whether the rights get exhausted nationally or territorially or internationally, because it has important ramifications in terms of availability of competing goods in the market, although intellectual property protected. We will also discuss ownership aspects and assignments aspects or licensing aspects of intellectual property rights, because as I mentioned, one of the core rights that are granted to intellectual property owners or property owners generally is a right to alienate your property. So, how ownership is then used in terms of assignment and licensing must be studied under this module. So, we will also discuss limitations and exceptions, which usually goes without compensation, in the sense that such limitations and exceptions are provided because of certain limited nature, since they do not usually conflict with the normal exploitation of the patent or normal exploitation of the intellectual property rights, and also provided they do not unreasonably prejudice their rights while considering the third party interests. So, what are these various limitations and exceptions granted in patent law, like research exemption or regulatory review exemption, or in copyright law in the form of fair dealing or fair use, statutory copyright exemptions or statutory licenses. So, we will study each of these in detail. Use without authorization and government use can also be regarded as an exemption. However, these type of exemption can involve specific payment of remuneration, and there may be additional conditions attached in the way such authorization is granted and such authorization is used. Finally, we will discuss a bunch of modules involving remedies and enforcement, both civil and criminal, because in case of copyright and trademark law it involves additional criminal remedies. However, generally most intellectual property laws at the core, they have the injunction, accounts for profits and damages as part of civil law remedies. So, this is how we are going to evolve this course and discuss this course modules in the days to come.